Good day, my name is Bill Humber and I'm happy to join you for the second season of The Green Citizen at Seneca College. I'm the Director of Office of Eco-Seneca Initiatives at Seneca College, and I want to thank our alumni people for making this series possible. Today I'm joined by Cheryl Bradbee. Cheryl is a multi-talented generalist expert in a variety of areas in our built-in natural environment. She's going to tell us a little bit about some of those areas, but I want to begin by examining this concept of urban resiliency, because I know it's something that Cheryl, you have spoken about, you have been concerned about for a long time, and I think it kind of introduces us to a kind of a broader perspective on environmental issues, which I think is sometimes lost when we carve these things up into little bits and pieces of a little bit of recycling here, a little bit of energy efficiency over there. We're kind of missing the big picture. Tell us what you mean by urban resiliency and why this is so important to us in today's environmental conversation.
Well, most people who talk about urban resiliency today are talking about things like floodproofing. They're talking about hardening infrastructure. So say like when Hurricane Sandy comes in, the subways don't flood. The trouble with that is that's all technological, and the technology is not the problem. I mean, though we do need to do those things, it's the social that's the problem. It's the political and the economics and how we organize ourselves to live together with each other and with the earth. So if we don't address those issues, if we don't address the underlying social systems and how we interact, then all of that resiliency planning, first of all, most likely won't get acted out, and secondly, won't get maintained. But it doesn't really solve the problem. It doesn't really put us on a sustainable course for the future. It's just a kind of Band-Aid. And so resiliency for me has to be social and the political and economic rather than just the technological.
Now, I know we talk about urban sustainability and we often frame it as we're getting pretty close to a cliff here. We might go over it one day. You possibly think we may have actually gone over the cliff. Tell me what you mean by that in terms of some of these environmental challenges and why resiliency really is the next stage of what we need to be looking at in terms of the kinds of places we live in and our relation to the planet as well.
Well, we're in climate change,
right?
So we're over the cliff. Done with that one. That argument's over. Sustainability, if we had had sustainable systems, would have kept us from going over the cliff. But we're over, done. Climate change is happening now. We can see the extreme weather, right? So we're in it. So that requires a different response, because now on top of the need to be sustainable, and what we were doing wasn't, so we now really have to get serious about social, economic, political systems because they didn't sustain us. We now have to add on to that the job and the cost of making the urban area resilient. And now, beyond flood things, you know, there's a whole issue of urban agriculture. When the Imperial Valley in California no longer produces 75% of this continent's food, how are we going to feed a city like Toronto? So now we're talking about urban resilience has to be green gardens on your rooftops, and all the malls should be supporting, you know, food on top. We should have greenhouses on top of every shopping store, right? On every grocery store, because they need to be producing food in the urban area. So again, but that's a social system thing as much as a technological thing, right? So.
Well, and the notion of green roofs or urban agriculture also has some other benefits from a water retention, water recharge point of view.
It's a good thing to do.
A heat island effect in the city. Talk about some of those benefits that would accrue from that.
Well, agriculture is one of my main areas. And I was fascinated when I did this research in 17th century Italy. Within the walls of the city, 30% of the land was devoted to agriculture. They built the canals originally for irrigating agriculture, but mostly not for irrigating like grain, but for irrigating your lettuce, because lettuce requires water every day, right? So they built this fantastic canal system to do that, and they were very committed to having that kind of agriculture, vegetables, truck gardens, right next door to where they lived, literally in the city. Because then, first of all, if an army comes and cuts off your access to the other agriculture, you can still eat. And secondly, it's just a whole lot easier to go out and pick your peach off of something that's really close. So we need to start rethinking. I mean, I look at the suburbs and I see all the land here that's given over to green turf. And that's maintained for a whole lot of other dumb reasons with what I call the mow and blow regime. You know, the guys who come in 15 minutes and mow it and blow it. You know, why is that not growing food? There are now grocery stores that are putting greenhouses on the grocery store. So you could go in and buy your vegetables and know they just picked it a minute ago up in the greenhouse on top of the store. I mean, which is awesome. But again, that mitigates heat, as you said. It greens up the urban area. You're not got a black roof that's absorbing all the heat. I mean, it's just healthy for people to be in touch with the dirt. We know that there's fungus and microbes in the dirt that actually help your immune system. So why are not a lot of people like seniors, we don't know what to do with a lot of our seniors. They could all be gardening and growing food that we could then be selling in the store, right? I mean, so, but again, that's a social systems issue. You have to somehow have something that you can put in place that connects all of these folks together, right? That unemployed people could be growing the food on the rooftops. So that's beyond the technology of how we put a greenhouse on a rooftop. That's a bigger thing.
I want to get into your research, and I know you've just completed your doctorate in this area. But before we do, let's just finish that conversation about rural Ontario, and as a provider of food, we know this is some of the finest agricultural land in the country. Yet I suspect if we looked seriously at Ontario growing and cash crops, the majority of what we're growing is for potato chips, industrial corn sweeteners, ethanol, a whole bunch of things that really have perhaps little to do with agriculture. So is part of the problem we have a kind of residual 19th century pastoral image of Ontario, which really isn't in keeping with the real Ontario that we see out there today?
Well, we have a residual 19th century understanding of our food production. It doesn't matter where it is, right? No. So again, we've got this issue of systems, because if we're gonna get serious about urban resilience, food production in the city, you're talking about a decentralized production method.
Right.
Same thing with energy, right? If you start putting solar panels on everybody's house, you have to create a decentralized system. That's not just a technological system, that is a social, economic, and political system. So that and if you're going to, like Peel Region, my garden, they all talk about fusion landscapes now, which I think is hilarious, because my garden technically was illegal 10 years when I planted it, right? But now everybody has fusion landscapes for water retention. Right. They want everybody to go to it for water retention. Well, that's a decentralized system. So that's a social, economic, political thing. Same thing with food. We have today this kind of global agriculture system. 6 companies in the world manage all of the food in the world, own all of the food production in the world, right? Most of your organic food is now owned by them if you go to one of the organic stores. So you now have to, if you're going to create resilience, you have to create a decentralized system. And I'll explain from my research how I understood that. My research looked at this canal system.
Let me just preface that. I want to kind of set up the story. We've talked about the 19th century, and we've said that a lot of our systems today are either romantic images of it, or that's when we developed the centralized infrastructure of sewer and water, and I guess to some extent energy as we get into the 20th century. But you went back further. You went back to the 16th century.
I went back to the Romans.
Well then, take us back through time and tell us where some of these models worked, where some of these models didn't work. Why did we get away from it? And tell us, and set up the story for us by telling us what you did your doctorate in through Dalhousie University.
Yes, I did it. I did it on this water system for a town in northern Italy named Piacenza, and they had a river nearby, about 10 kilometers away, and they took the water from the river and conducted it through a whole network of canals that fed the agricultural fields around the city and then to the city. The city was kind of the bottom end of the canal system. But of course, they didn't have pumps in those days or electricity, right? So you can't have a centralized technological structure because there is no such critter. So what they had instead was what they called consortii, small groups of people who bought the rights to different parts of the canals, and they had to keep the canal in repair, they had to maintain it, and they could sell the water rights to their neighbors, right? So this whole system, even in the city, each canal, section by section, was managed and owned by these consortia, which would be the people who bordered the canal, who used the canal. The millers were particularly important in maintaining the canals. So this whole thing, because you couldn't flip a switch and make everything work, which is how we do things today. That's why we have sewer and water systems where literally some professional engineer flips a switch and it all works, right? I don't have to deal with my neighbor. If my neighbor is not managing his water correctly, it doesn't matter to me. However, in their system, if their neighbor didn't manage their access to the canal correctly, it would affect me. And so you've got this incredible social network of these people individually and as consortia, as these associations, and as the millers who, of course, depended upon the water flowing for their livelihood. You have this incredible association of people. It's very decentralized. So then how do you make a system work?
Yeah.
What happens when you have to build a new canal? How do you make sure that the new canal is built the same way so it fits in with the old canal? Or when someone adds a pipe to the old to the canal, how do you ensure that? Well, the city oversaw the whole thing. And so they had to manage it socially, right? So there was a committee that was made up of what became experts. They were nobles most of the time, but they, you know, some of them sat on this committee for 10 years. They became experts in sewage. And they would, you know, take all the complaints. I read through 3,000 letters
Wow.
of people complaining. My canal inlet is backed up and I've got sewage in my basement. You know, same stuff you read today. It was really quite humorous
Except
in some
this
ways.
is 500 years ago.
500 years ago. And so then they had to fix things. They had to make sure things got fixed. And every now and then they'd issue an order and would say, everybody in the city, no matter your class or what you do or where you live, has to go out and clean out the canal. You know, and so it was great employment because the nobles, of course, wouldn't go clean the canals. They would go hire, you know, somebody to do it. So they had to oversee this incredible social network that made the canals work. The only time the canals didn't work, that system didn't work, was when a local feudal lord who had the power, because of all the politics in Italy, took control of the mouth of the canal, the major canal system where it came out of the river. And he was able to stand opposed to the city management. And he was able literally to cut off the water to the whole city of 30,000 people. And so that all got resolved politically at the upper echelons because at that time Italy was moving toward absolutist dukes and stuff. But really the day-to-day process was all of these little associations of people. And it did two things. First of all, you had to know your neighbor and work with them, right? And secondly, people knew the system. So if I asked you to talk about today's sewage system, could you name the pipes and the way it works?
No, I
Probably
could not.
couldn't, and you probably wouldn't want to either.
No.
But those people, they would write a letter to this committee, and they would be able to say the inlet located such and such a place on such and such a canal is blocked up and is therefore causing problems for me. They were absolutely precise. They knew how they got their water, and they knew how their sewage was managed.
Now, you live in a house here that you participated in the building of, the conceptualization of it. Many of these issues obviously were part of the process because this house has many attributes that one would look and say, wow, those people were really ahead of their time in terms of some of these issues technologically, but also perhaps socially. Talk about that process as well, because that, in many ways, I think ties into your areas of research and interest and study.
Yes, because again, this house, it's a straw bale house, and we had to go over the heads of the city of Mississauga to get it built in 2000, to get the permit from the provincial government because the walls don't have a moisture barrier in them. So it's a straw bale. It's also a healthy house. It was built for someone with multiple chemical sensitivities. And so every material in the house was tested by her to see if she could live with it. So you'll see that there's very limited materiality in the house, and it's used a lot of different ways. Over and over again, and kind of, so we had to invent everything we did. It was like one big studio project for about 3 years, because we literally had to think through and invent everything, because she was so sensitive to all the materiality. However, the real issue, of course, is not the materiality of the house, other than maintenance. The real issue becomes, as a household, how do you function within this space? Is everybody committed to the same eco-vision? So, for example, I live car-free. When I work at Seneca or at Humber or somewhere else, I commute 2 hours by 3 buses or 2 systems or whatever to get there, and it's tedious, and I really don't like it. And that's part of the lack of transportation systems in our region, and it's really quite a problem. However, I have a housemate who commutes by car a mile away. So that's a very different vision of how
Yeah.
one lives in this situation, right?
Right.
I walk 4 kilometers to go shopping.
Right.
So the issue, again, we have all these different social, political, economic assumptions
Right.
that have come into being in this household. And I'm just beginning to really understand this at this time. It's taken me 10 years to kind of go, why does so-and-so not think the same way I do on this?
Right.
But that's on a larger scale exactly the problem we have socially. I mean, you all take this seriously. You're doing eco initiatives. But how many of the student body at Seneca or any other place actually do take it all seriously?
Well, let's talk about that, because you have been in the classroom. You have done, I know at Seneca College, you've done extraordinary work around design issues and using the latest technology to try and wrestle with some of these issues. You also have and continue to teach at Humber College. Talk about some of the challenges you find in addressing these issues with students today in 2013. What kind of attitudes, what kind of perceptions, what kind of interest is there in this conversation?
I think it varies a lot. One thing at Seneca and Humber, I remember when I taught environmental science to civil engineers, and I remember we got to the part on climate change. And I finally looked at them and I said, why are you all not out in the streets marching?
Yeah.
This is your generation. This is your future. We've robbed you of it with this. And they looked at me, and a lot of them were from other countries.
Right.
And they said, well, Cheryl, no one ever told us this. We didn't know. So that's the first thing, is there's a general ignorance. People just don't even know. Secondly, the media's had this whole kind of pseudo conversation with the deniers, right? So people think they're being cool by denying.
Right.
And I remember I was talking in a class at Humber one point, and it wasn't my class, I'd been invited in. And so I walked in, and about a bunch of the guys were sitting in the back, how they do. And they said, we don't have a problem with it, and you could just see the whole thing was about, I'm going to be a climate change denier because that's really cool.
Right.
And I thought, Lord love you, but why has your teacher allowed you to assume this posture,
Yeah.
Why haven't you been totally dissed at this point? You should know it's not cool. And frankly, a lot of the adults I talk to still kind of, well, this and that. Or there's the magical thinking of technology will save us, which is, to me, fantasy. It's
or
magic.
the marketplace will save us.
Yeah,
I guess that's the other side of
kind
the
of magical thinking,
conversation.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
So if you had to kind of leave us with some thinking about the future and thinking about ourselves as part of that future and thinking about the next generation and future generations, what are some of the stories and learnings that you think people should be engaging? Because to some extent it's not really I don't find an acceptable excuse to say, well, nobody's ever told me, or I've never, because the resources are out there to find out, right?
Yes.
One can learn about the world if one, makes the effort to do so. So what are some of the kind of messages that you would leave with people today?
When I'm not depressed?
Well, yeah.
Young people, I love working with them and teaching them. They're awesome. They're amazing. But you cannot hide from this. And I think there's still a great desire to hide from this. And because it feels overwhelming,
Right.
there's no solutions. We're just going to have to tough it out. So let's just hide from it, or make as much money as we can so we can ride through it. And I always think of Greenland in that situation, because if you think of Greenland in the year 1000, the climate changed, the community began to die off. And what happened was the richest people were the last to die off. So being rich does not save you from this, okay? So we just have to get very creative, and everybody needs to do their part. And while we need to have major change in our social, political, economic systems, like I said, a revolution, you can still go out and do this small thing. You can find a way to begin to counter that narrative, to begin to find that new economy and that new polity, that new social approach. And so, yes, this household was co-housing, and now it's kind of struggling as a household, but we did it. I've learned from it. My next thing will be something else that hopefully succeeds a bit longer. The garden has been an awesome teacher to me. Go out and garden, really. Go out and grow your own food. Learn to sew your own clothes. Do something where you're a little bit more economically resilient yourself, and then spread it.
Cheryl, this has been spectacular. Thank you very much for this, and we'll be keenly following your next step and that next great innovation that you're engaged with. Thank you very much.
All right, my pleasure.